good morning to all of you. If you are in India or anywhere else in the world, good afternoon, good evening, hopefully not good night. We're about to get started with Dr. Sean Pryor's talk on modern poetry, let's say. Uh, just to give you some context, we have been doing a series of talks on modernism for the last 2 or 3 years in IIT Gandhinagar. If I could please request everyone to switch off their audio so that we do not have noise. Thank you. Okay, so we've been doing a series of talks and seminars on, loosely speaking, modernism. As we were discussing before the beginning of this talk, Sean or Dr. Pryor may not necessarily talk about the nomenclature as such, but we are talking about a late modernist, maybe a late modernist poet. More on that, of course, from Dr. Pryor himself. So it's part of a sort of ongoing discussion on modernisms, global modernisms in Europe and outside Europe, India, etc., that we have been doing for the last few years. In fact, this semester, again, I'm teaching a course on modernism, and we did talk very briefly about the modernist position on language, the critique of language as a medium of representation, a very little bit of Saussure and this idea of the arbitrary signifier. I know that Dr. Pryor would talk about Peirce and semiotics in a very specific context of poetry, talking about Graham. Without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Pryor first. Uh, a little more informally, I've known him for a number of years from my doctoral years in Sydney, and it has always been a pleasure talking to him. I remember the days of going to UNSW to attend the Modernism seminar series and the wonderful talks that they had for a number of years. Dr. Sean Pryor is an associate professor in English at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, Australia. He writes on 19th and 20th century poetry with a focus on modernism. He's the author of Poetry, Modernism, and an Imperfect World, 2017, and recently edited the Cambridge Companion to the Poem, 2024. He's currently working on the history and theory of the idea of poetic technique. And his talk today is titled Diction and World in W.S. Graham. Over to you, Sean, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
No, thanks very much. Thanks for that really lovely introduction. And thank you for having me. It's tremendous. And yes, I remember those master classes and workshops and reading groups, part of the Modernism Centre. It was good times. It's a shame that the Modernism Centre is no longer with us, but it's great to be here. And thanks very much for inviting. I welcome to everybody too, and I really hope that this is helpful to you. Can you hear me okay? Or I should just make sure. Yep. Okay, great. If for whatever reason you stop being able to hear me, let me know and I can always turn off my video. I hope this is helpful to you. As Oracle said, I don't actually talk very much about modernism, but we could do that afterwards if you would like in conversation. That would be perfectly fine. What I do want to do in the talk itself is think about two things, really. I want to think about diction, which is to say about the words used in poetry. And I want to think about world, about what it means for a literary work to represent or to create, especially to create a world, as well as how that literary world is then related to the real world, the world in which the work is composed and received. So diction and world. Maybe especially if you've been thinking about global modernisms, the thinking about world might be interesting. But actually, the thinking about diction should be too, I hope. So the diction of poetry is a problem over which countless poets and critics and philosophers and other thinkers and writers have argued for thousands of years. To take a very famous example, from the history of poetry in English, Thomas Gray in the 18th century thought that so-called poetic diction necessarily differs from ordinary language. That is to say, poems require a vocabulary that is different from that used by ordinary people in the course of their ordinary lives. At the end of the 18th century, William Wordsworth, in contrast, thought that in fact poetry lies precisely in the language of ordinary people. So it's a very famous difference of opinion, if you like, between Gray and Wordsworth, but it's really just one episode in a much longer story of the thinking about diction in poetry. Now, the idea that literary works make worlds is also very old and has received a good deal of renewed attention in recent years. So you might be familiar, for instance, with Peng Chia's 2016 book, What is a World? Or perhaps with Eric Hyo's 2012 book, On Literary Worlds. They're probably the most famous examples. And much of this thinking about literary worlds in the last 10, 20 years has focused, for obvious and good reasons, on fiction. The idea being that a narrative text creates a world of a certain scope and texture by representing through character and action and place a coherent totality of spatial and temporal relations. Which means to say that world making, literary world making, is a matter of diegesis. Now that puts poetry, and especially lyric poetry, in a rather awkward position. Though Hyo has argued that poetry too can create worlds, and that lyric poems do so as much through form as through diegesis. So the form of a sonnet, perhaps, rather than the telling of a story with characters in imagined places. Almost inevitably, others have disagreed with Hyo's argument about the world-making of lyric poetry. So Jonathan Culler, for instance, insists that lyric poems refer to the world rather than creating their own worlds. Because Culler argues that lyric poems are epideictic. They refer to the world and, in some fashion, act as acts of praise, whereas fiction is diegetic, it invents worlds. Lyrics for Culler are a matter of words, not worlds. And without getting further caught up in those debates, really what I want to do today is to ask whether words themselves, even as they refer to the world beyond the poem or attached to the world beyond the poem, might contribute to a poem's world making. So diction and world. But I should be honest, really, most of all, I just want to talk about what I think is a superb and wonderful poem by W.S.Graham. Graham, I'm conscious, may not be familiar to you. So by way of very brief introduction, W.S. Graham was born in Scotland in 1918, and he was associated in the early 1940s as a very young poet with Dylan Thomas, with other English poets who were in fashion at the time, sometimes then and now going under the label of the New Apocalypse poets. Graham then moved to Cornwall in 1944. He lived by the sea. He didn't have a permanent job for many years. He lived without much money in relative poverty and in considerable isolation, as to be said. Graham's most famous poem is probably The Night Fishing, a genuinely wonderful poem which I highly recommend. It was published in 1955. Graham continued to write on into the 1980s and died in 1986. To an extent, and you'll often see this written about Graham, he was overlooked during his lifetime. He was not nearly, for instance, as famous or as fated as a Ted Hughes or a Les Murray from Australia or whomever else it might be. Though it has to be said at the same time, I mean, he was published by Faber and Faber. His poems appeared in major poetry magazines on both sides of the Atlantic. So he was by no means entirely ignored. Certainly in the last 20 years or so, he has enjoyed a good deal more attention. There have been new editions of the poems and the letters, major monographs on Graham's work, and a few edited collections as well. Now, the poem I want to look at is called Malcolm Mooney's Land. I hope that you have had a chance to read it. If not, nevertheless, the talk should, I hope, make good sense. You'll see here that Malcolm Mooney's Land appeared in Poetry magazine, published in Chicago in 1966, alongside, as it happens, the 15th installment of Louis Zukofsky's long poem, A. Now, Zukofsky is frequently bracketed as a modernist or as a late modernist. And whether and how Graham too might be a late modernist is a good question. But as I said, it's not something I'm going to be dealing with in the talk itself, but we could talk it through afterwards if you would like. It's interesting to see Graham positioned here next to Zukofsky, I think. Now, Malcolm Mooney's Land is a poem in 5 unequal sections. It's a dramatic monologue, at least of sorts. The eponymous Malcolm Mooney is an Arctic explorer, and the poem tells of his experience out on the ice, in a place or a region which he calls Malcolm Mooney's Land. As I think should be pretty clear from a reading of the poem also teases the suggestion that the poem itself is Malcolm Mooney's Land. By which I mean, it's not just that the poem is about this Arctic world. The poem is, in some sense, itself the Arctic world. Or, if you like, the Arctic world is a figure for this particular poem and maybe also for poetry in general. So there's a teasing, sometimes paradoxical, certainly suggestive association and sometimes even identification between the Arctic world that the poem invents or creates, so to speak, and the world of the poem itself, or the poem itself as a world. And here is the first section of the poem. So we'll just, I'll do my best. My accent is not appropriate, but forgive me. Today, Tuesday, I decided to move on, although the wind was veering. Better to move than have them at my heels, poor friends I buried earlier under the printed snow. From wherever it is I urge these words to find their subtle vents, the northern dazzle of silence cranes to watch. Footprint on footprint, word on word, and each on a fool's errand. Malcolm Mooney's Land. Elizabeth was in my thoughts all morning, and the boy. Wherever I speak from, or in what particular voice, this is always a record of me. I can record, at least out there to the west, the grinding bergs, and listen, further off where we are going, the glacier calves, making its sudden momentary thunder. This is as good a night, a place as any. So you can see how Graham's poem sets out a world, a specific totality of temporal and spatial relations, and that it does so diegetically. We have here presented to us a past and a present, a here and a there. There are fellow explorers who've been lost. There's a family left at home. There's a natural landscape. There's a journey. And there is also a psychology. Moreover, at least at first, there's nothing very obtrusive or striking about the diction, the vocabulary of this opening section. So, before we look more closely at Malcolm Mooney's Land, in order to get at the diction of this opening section and the rest of the poem, I want to just think some more about diction and poetry in general. And to do that, in contrast, here is a stanza from Graham's most famous poem, the long poem, The Night Fishing. My need reads in light more specially gendered and ambitioned by all eyes that wide have been me once. The cross-tree light, yellowing now, swings clean across Orion, and waned, and very gently the old signs tilt and somersault towards their home. The undertow, come hard round, now leans the tiller strongly jammed over on my hip bone. So I hope you can see clearly the difference between this stanza from The Night Fishing and that opening section of Malcolm Mooney's Land. This is, if nothing else, a lot harder to understand. In comparison to the opening stanza of Malcolm Mooney's Land, this stanza from The Night Fishing features twisted syntax, resonant assonance, verbal abstraction, and conspicuous figuration. Graham's earliest poems, the poems he was publishing 10, 12 years before this, move even further away from ordinary speech. And it has to be said, not everyone liked Graham's earlier style. So, reviewing The Night Fishing, this poem, in the year that it was published, 1955, the English poet and critic Donald Davie, for instance, complained about what he called Graham's unvarying solemnity of tone and Graham's use of words such as ambition. He really didn't like that word ambition there in the second line. Davie wasn't alone in commenting on Graham's diction, and he certainly wasn't alone in complaining about it. It's striking, however, that Davie doesn't say precisely what's wrong with ambition. He just assumes that readers will agree with him that ambition is an error. It might be that Davie objects to ambition alongside gendered because it's an ostentatiously polysyllabic participle and not in common usage. It's quite possible that Davie had simply never before encountered ambition and that he thought it was Graham's neologism. If he had wanted to, Davie could have found an earlier instance of the participle gendered in Keats, but he would have had to look very hard or look at a dictionary to find an early instance of the past participle of ambition. It's also not impossible that Graham himself found ambition in the dictionary. For a friend later recalled that when Graham was living as a young man in Glasgow, he'd write poetry by compiling long lists of words, and that he got these words from dictionaries and thesauruses. Seems to me very much the practice of a young poet. If so, it's no wonder that Davie objected to ambition and more generally to Graham's diction. In his influential book on poetry and diction, Purity of Diction in English Verse, Davie argues that a poet's diction should depend not on books, but on living speech. The poet is responsible for purifying and correcting the spoken language, Davie proposes, in an echo of Eliot echoing Mallarmé. So there's a bit of modernism for you. The diction of the best poetry, Davie continues, is conversational. However, it's not colloquial. Davie makes a distinction between the conversational and the colloquial. By this, he means the diction of the best poetry is the kind of thing you might hear in a university classroom or perhaps at the club, but not in a working class pub or in rural Yorkshire. Poetry, Davie says, should use the language of the capital, not the provinces. The diction of the best poetry, Davie concludes, is central to the language. In all these ways, ambition clearly is peripheral. It's not central. That would explain Davie's objection. Now, the position Davie outlines in Purity of Diction in English Verse represents a common set of assumptions, and Graham himself sometimes shared these assumptions. So, for instance, in 1945, Graham cautioned the poet David Wright about what he called the artificial classicism of Wright's diction, about Wright's choice of what Graham called coldly exotic words, such as aquatile and mezzanine. For Graham, it was much better to choose what he called physical and early English words, such as wood and drunk. Now, these assumptions rely on a logic of centre and periphery. The idea is that common words, words in general use or words used by most people, or, as is probably often the case, words used by people who are able to represent themselves as being at the centre of society, these common words seem to occupy the linguistic centre. Such words are, or are thought to be, available to all, equally available to all. And then on the peripheries, one has various other kinds of word. So, for instance, words specific to the sciences, or words recently borrowed from other languages, or words belonging to a particular trade or profession, or slang words, or dialect words. Such words, for Davie, are not central to the language, and so not good for poetry. Now, I want to say at this point that I am conscious that the term dialect is problematic, and that the supposed distinction between a dialect and a language is rather more political than it is linguistic. After all, as they say, a language is just a dialect with an army and a navy. But for the purposes of this paper, I'm going to stick with the term dialect because it represents that logic of centre and periphery. And Graham writes both with and against that logic. It's certainly the case that Graham employs that logic of centre and periphery when he tells Wright that Aquilin and mezzanine are exotic. Graham's examples also demonstrate the historical dimension, which often underwrites the separation of centre from periphery. So, for instance, Aquilin was borrowed from Latin in the early 17th century, and mezzanine was borrowed from Italian via French a century later. Wood and drunk, the words which Graham prefers, are instead good early medieval Anglo-Saxon words. So from this perspective, the older a word is, the more central it is to the language. Now, this logic of centre and periphery can underwrite both the description and the evaluation of poetry, as we saw in Davies' review of The Night Fishing. Even defences of the supposedly peripheral will sometimes reinscribe this logic. So, for example, in 1844, the English poet William Barnes defended his decision to write poems in the dialect of Dorset by arguing that it was precisely from what Barnes called, the provincial dialects, that philologists would be able to purify our tongue. That's Barnes's phrase, purging the English language of Latin and Greek loanwords. For Barnes, that is, the geographical peripheries preserve the true linguistic centre, and they do so because the geographical peripheries are in touch with the historical centre, with the language's origins. It's in the capital cities that people get too excited about Latin Greek loanwords, says Barnes, or newfangled scientific terms, whatever else it might be. Now, very clearly, there is a political dimension to these debates about language and poetry, which needs to be remembered and emphasised. The problem of diction could, in this context, be called a problem of propriety, in the sense both of ownership or belonging and of the suitable or successful. So there is the question of who owns certain words, or to whom those words belong. And at the same time, there is the question of which words are suitable when writing a poem, which words make for successful poetry. Those questions seem separate, but are very often entangled together. Even as far back as Aristotle's Poetics, thinkers have distinguished between common or standard words and rare or exotic words. So Aristotle's terms for this are kurios, standard, and xenikos, exotic. Within the latter category, within the category of exotic words, Aristotle includes both metaphors and words borrowed from dialects or other languages. This is a distinction which also seems to separate centre and periphery. But actually, Aristotle is careful to recommend that poets should employ both the standard and the exotic. Moreover, Aristotle recognizes that what one community has borrowed, and so what will be exotic for that first community, will necessarily be standard for another community, for the community from which the word has been borrowed. But if Aristotle was sympathetically open and relativist about poetic diction, modern poetic practice and criticism was often closed. Modern poetic practice and criticism assumed frequently that what is common to one community should be common to all, and that in poetry only what is common is good. In this vein, the poet and critic Daniel Tiffany has argued recently that much modern poetry reproduces what he calls a lyric diction, an apparently plain style which imagines itself quite magically to be operating without the social characteristics of race or class. For Tiffany, words index social being. Words are attached, he says, to shared but also isolated historical experiences. What Tiffany calls lyric diction presumes that in poetry, common words are best, and it pretends that what is common for some is common for all, or insists that it ought to be. Again, there is a politics to this poetics. So, having said all that, let's look now again at Malcolm's Land. Towards the end of that first stanza, you'll remember, Graham writes that the glacier calves, making its sudden momentary thunder. What about that word calves? Graham had a long-standing interest in the history of Arctic exploration and in the language of Arctic exploration. Later in the poem, you'll know if you've had a chance to read it, Graham refers in passing to Fridtjof Nansen, the late 19th and early 20th century Norwegian explorer. And Graham read Nansen's book, Farthest North, a record or account of Nansen's expeditions, which was published in 1897. Now, Nansen also speaks about glaciers calving. In his diary on the 9th of August 1895, for instance, Nansen writes that the shore ice lying along the land is very remarkable, and Nansen guesses that perhaps some violent pressure has heaved the sea ice up together with pieces of ice from the calving of the glaciers. Now, it's quite possible that Graham encountered the word calve, or this sense of the word calve, in Nansen's writing, but I don't mean to suggest that its appearance here in the poem is an allusion to Nansen, because glaciers are frequently said to calve by those who are familiar with them, or familiar with the language for them. A stranger to glaciers would instead be likely to apply some other word. If I were to visit the Arctic and to see a glacier calve, I'd probably instead speak of a glacier collapsing. Calve, in this sense, is an explorer's word. It's a sailor's word. It's a specialist term specific to a particular domain or trade. It's a kind of jargon. Though I hasten to add, I don't mean jargon in a pejorative sense. I just mean a specialist language. There is a comparable moment later in the poem when Graham writes, "Out at the far off edge I hear colliding voices, drifted, yes, to find me through the slowly opening leads." Now that word lead is another nautical or Arctic term. It means a channel in an ice field. It's another piece of jargon. It's specific to a profession, to sailors and explorers. Nansen writes that at one point, he suddenly heard the well-known sound of a whale blowing from a lead close behind. Graham's leads, like the calving glaciers, are in this sense concrete features of the poem's icy world. They are firmly part of the diegesis, and Graham's diction matches and supports that diegesis. But lead has other meanings. Early in the poem, Mooney petitions a sail to lead me. He asks this seal to lead him. That means that he uses lead as a verb, in a sense related to that sense of the noun lead as a clue, a guiding indication. This is the sense of lead, for instance, with which one might say that a hard-boiled detective follows a lead. And that makes Graham's line here, "to find me through the slowly opening leads," rather more ambiguous. It's as if the colliding voices seek Mooney out, or as if they find Mooney in search for the solution to some other unnamed mystery. Moreover, given the poem's identification of the icy expanse with the white of the paper on which the poem is printed, and given the identification of footprints in the ice or snow with printed words, it's tempting also to hear L-E-A-D as lead, meaning a thin strip of metal used by printers to separate lines of type. In that case, the voices search for Mooney in the space between the lines of the poem, marked out by the leads, the strips of metal that separate those lines. Neatly, this is possible only for the printed poem, which doesn't choose between the voicings lead and lead, When I read the poem silently to myself, I have to decide, or sorry, the poem itself doesn't tell me how to pronounce the word lead. It's only when I perform the poem out loud, or I suppose silently to myself, that I have to decide on one voicing the other. Now, to use specialist terms such as carve and lead is partly to seek for accuracy, right? It's to choose the word that belongs to the thing. At the end of Malcolm Mooney's Land, Graham writes of endless drifting hummock crests. He could instead have written of hill crests, or to keep the same rhythm, of hillock crests. But hummock makes better sense because it's specifically a nautical term. Hummock means first a small rise on a coast seen from a ship, and then second, subsequently, a protuberance of ice. In this respect, jargon particular to a trade or a domain has the virtue of precision. At the same time, to move from lead to lead via one of the poem's dominant tropes is to shift the grounds of lexical accuracy, or you might say, to expand the grounds of lexical accuracy. Oddly, the world of Malcolm Mooney's Land is not only a world of Arctic exploration, but also one of the printing press. It's through the diction of the poem that this alignment of Arctic world with the world of the printed poem is achieved. Now, let's expand the world of the poem further by looking at a stanza from the second section. Land lice, always my good bedfellows, ride with me in my sweaty scenes. Come, bonny friendly beasts, brother to the grammar sow and the word louse. Bite me your presence, keep me awake and cold with work to do, to remember to put down something to take back. I've reached the edge of earshot here. By the laws of distance, my words go through the smoking air, changing their tune in silence. Bonny, there in the third line, is clearly Scots. Excuse me. Land lice, in the first line, is a rather odd compound. It's not obviously a term which belongs to a specific community, as bonny and lead do. Land lice looks instead to be Graham's invention, a kind of riff on the common term sea louse. Similarly, word louse in the fourth line is clearly a riff on wood louse. Graham certainly liked to invent compounds and to coin words, as many of his critics have observed. But what's a grammar sound? In 1895, in a book called Randigal Rhymes and a Glossary of Cornish Words, Joseph Thomas defined grammar sow as a millipede. From the perspective of a Donald Davie, therefore, to speak in a poem of a grammar sow rather than of a millipede is culpably to choose the language of the periphery. That is to say, the word grammar sow indexes a community far from society's political and literary centre. In turn, the entry for grammar sow in Frederick Jago's The Ancient Language and the Dialect of Cornwall, 1882, directs the reader to sow pig, which Jago then defines as a woodlouse. Now, to use grammar sow rather than woodlouse is to choose a Cornish compound over a compound of two supposedly common words. And it is, again, to choose the periphery over the centre. It's also important to note that though lead and calves have meanings specific to a trade or domain, to communities of sailors and explorers, they have meanings which are, so to speak, common. A reader unfamiliar with the jargon of Arctic exploration might be a bit puzzled by the meanings of those words in this poem, but such a reader will at least be familiar with them as words. Hummock and grammar sow are different. It might be that such a reader could guess at hummock, but it's pretty difficult to guess at grammar sow, other than perhaps to imagine, given the context, that it must be some kind of insect comparable to a louse. That is to say, for a reader unfamiliar with Cornish dialect, grammar sow makes reading newly difficult. Now, you'll remember that for Daniel Tiffany, lyric diction imagines itself quite magically as operating without the social characteristics of race or class. To speak in a poem of a grammar sound, I want to suggest, is to break that magic spell. It is openly to advertise the fact that words are specific to communities determined by race, class, history, nation, region, education, and a host of other factors. But it's not that Mooney himself represents a community on the so-called periphery. It's not that Mooney is a member of a community which speaks Cornish. Mooney doesn't speak uniformly or even predominantly in a Cornish dialect. Instead, it's the individual word which is at issue. And different words in this poem are attached to different communities. Hummock on the one hand, Grammar on the other. Now, you've probably also noticed that Thomas and Jago both spell Grammar with an E. Oh, sorry. There we go. Both spell Grammar with an E. In his glossary to Graham's new collected poems, Matthew Francis explains that Grammar with an A is Graham's deliberate misspelling of Grammar with an E. This is a very Derridian part of the poem, has to be said. One effect of this new spelling is that the word puns on grammar, a word which derives through Old French and through Latin from the Greek graphein, meaning to write. This makes perfect sense. There's plenty of wordplay and play about words in Malcolm Mooney's land. If Grammar with an A is Graham's deliberate misspelling of a word belonging to a particular speech community and not a speech community of which Graham himself was a member, it becomes, at least to some extent, Graham's word. As it appears in the poem, the word Grammar still indexes that original speech community, but it also signifies. However, when Jago directs his reader from Grammar to Sowpig, he offers as an alternative to Sowpig the term Grammar with A. And in fact, as it happens, both spellings with an A and with an E had been in circulation since the 19th century and remain in circulation today. When Graham explained that, and I quote, Grammar is a Cornish dialect word for a woodlouse, he spelt the word with an A, which doesn't suggest that Graham had to coin a compound by substituting grammar with an A for grammar with an E. That is to say, it's not necessarily the case that Graham had to invent a word by misspelling an existing word to achieve that pun on grammar. Instead, the pun was, so to speak, already there for Graham to exploit, or quite possibly already there for Graham to exploit. So the upshot of this, I think, is that Graham's Grammar moves between collective and individual. On the one hand, the word indexes a social group. It advertises the fact that words are specific to communities. For Tiffany, this is what defines diction. Diction pertains to a collective and therefore transpersonal dimension of language, Tiffany says. But on the other hand, as Veronica Forrest Thompson has argued, when a poem tries to imitate the diction and cadences of ordinary speech, there remains a gap. The poem, says Forrest Thompson, is always different from the utterances it includes or imitates. In Malcolm Mooney's land, Grammar represents Graham's choice of a dialect word over a so-called standard word like millipede, or it represents Graham's pun on that dialect word, or it represents his deliberate misspelling of that dialect. All these readings are possible, and they all attach the word to Graham as an individual. For some poets and critics, moreover, it's this second aspect of diction which most matters. Diction, from this perspective, is personal. It's defined by choice. Mooney, in fact, refers explicitly to my words, and a word may be mine because I choose it, even if at the same time it belongs to a community from whom I inherit or borrow it. Graham understood this very well, I think. In a short statement on the nature of poetry, which Graham wrote early in his career, he said that language contains the shape of all of us, and that each word changes every time it is brought to life, and that in fact each single word uttered twice becomes a new word each time. In this conception, The dialectic of collective and individual extends from the individual poet or speaker to the individual utterance or instance. That is to say, the grammar sow in Malcolm Mooney's Land is not the same grammar sow as the grammar sow in another later poem by Graham titled Winter and the Grammar Sow. In its collective aspect, as a dialect word, grammar sow might be judged peripheral to the dominant language of modern poetry in English and even of Graham's own poetry. Again, Malcolm Mooney's Land is not a poem in a Cornish dialect, like a poem by Louise Bennett in Jamaican Creole. Graham did write a couple of ballads in Scots, but otherwise the basic idiom of his poetry is English. This means that in Malcolm Mooney's Land, grammar sow seems to be an exotic word set against the poem's standard idiom, almost as if the poem itself separates a periphery from a centre. In its individual aspect, Graham's grammar sow with an A misspells grammar sow with an E, or puns on grammar, or both. And to hear that pun is to attend to grammar sow not as a word passively inherited from a speech community, but as a word actively made new by an individual poet in an individual poem. This making words new is true too of land lice, a compound which seems to adapt sea lice by substituting land for sea. And nevertheless, or at the same time, a Scottish reader might think that land lice refers specifically to the lice which Mooney has carried from his house in Scotland, because land is a Scots term for tenement. The land lice have been, as Mooney says, always my good bedfellows. And in another poem titled Greenock at Night I Find You, Graham refers specifically to the bed at the top of the land, that is to say, at the top of the tenement where he was born. In this way, land lice also moves between indexing a collective and signifying an individual. It's both an invention and a borrowing, if you like. But it does so only when we speculate about different readers. So land lice can mean one thing if you're familiar with the Scots term land, and it can mean other things if you're not. That is to say, the meanings of words aren't defined solely by speakers. They're defined also by audiences. We can ask, can Graham's reader be assumed to know the Scots word land, in addition to land's English meanings? Can the reader be expected to know, when reading in the 5th section of Malcolm Mooney's Land of early hunters skittering across the ice, that skitter, which in so-called standard English means to move or run rapidly, is in Cornish both a verb meaning to make a stone hop and skim along the surface of water, and a noun meaning a track on ice or frozen snow. We think of words as indexed to specific speech communities, but we need also to think of words as speaking to specific communities and speaking to different communities in different ways. Graham understood that words come from and speak to particular communities, and that some words common in some communities are wholly unintelligible to people from other communities. Sometimes, when writing a letter to a friend, Graham would provide glosses for Scots words in his poems. But none of the volumes which Graham published during his lifetime includes a glossary, which suggests that he was happy for some or even most of his readers to be puzzled, or to make of the poems what they can, given what they know. So, we can think about the diction of a poem in a variety of words. Old words, new words, big words, little words, common words, uncommon words, figurative words, non-figurative words, central words, peripheral words, and so on. We can think about the diction of a poem as a whole, a poem in Scots, a poem in so-called standard English, and we can think about individual words within a poem, even when those words differ in kind from the poem's general idiom. So, a Scots word in an otherwise English poem, for example. We can think about the words of a poem as tying it to various communities. Perhaps the poetry reading public for whom a lyric diction seems normal and good, or a rural and regional community for whom dialect is perfectly normal, or an educated community willing and able to follow a poet's etymological play, and so on. Sometimes attaching the poem to one community will mean alienating another. I want to suggest that we can also think of a poem's words as being involved in the creation of the poem's world, and that this is as true of Grammar as it is of Calves. So Malcolm Mooney's land makes its world through a good deal of diegesis, references to a supposedly real landscape, hunters skittering across the ice, and so forth. But it's also true that when Mooney speaks of bonny friendly beasts, the world of the poem extends to Scotland, because it extends to the speech community to which Bonnie belongs and to which Bonnie speaks. Grammar extends the world of the poem to Cornwall, because it indexes a speech community of that place. A way to put this would be to say the world of Malcolm Mooney's land is a world in which Scots and the Cornish dialect exist, alongside the jargon of Arctic exploration and so-called Standard English. So the scope and texture of the poem's world are certainly shaped by referentiality, by references to hunters and to footprints in the snow, but also by indexicality, words from here and there, then and now, this group and that group. Given the way in which words like Gramersow and skitter and land remind us of how important readers are and how different readers can be, I also want to suggest that the world of the poem is co-created. The world which I make with Malcolm Mooney's land, or the world the poem makes for me, may not coincide exactly with the world it makes for you, or which you make with it. Now, it may have seemed odd to have focused so long on Gramersow, because the Gramersow itself isn't actually in the poem's imagined diegesis. There's ice, there are crevices, there are even land lice in the seams of Mooney's clothes, but there aren't actually any Gramersows. It's only that Mooney thinks of the Gramersow in apostrophizing the land lice. The Gramersows are imagined into the world of the poem by an act of comparison. What does that mean for the poem's world? Look again at that word calves. As a technical term for the behavior of glaciers, the word indicates a concrete feature of that icy landscape, and it indexes a community who live and work in that landscape. This sense of calves is relatively recent. It appears only in the 19th century. But the word is actually much older than that. It's an Anglo-Saxon word meaning to give birth to a calf. That is to say, ice calves when it gives birth, as a cow gives birth to a calf. In fact, the noun calf can itself mean a fragment of ice detached from a glacier or an iceberg. Used of glaciers and icebergs, both noun and verb were originally metaphors. And I think calve retains this metaphorical force in Malcolm Mooney's land. Or you could say Graham reanimates the metaphor, the dead metaphor. The glacier gives birth, like a whale or a reindeer. Aristotle brackets metaphors with borrowed and foreign words as departures from standard vocabulary, and in Graham's poem, calves is at once metaphor and jargon. Now, I want to argue that the poem animates the metaphor because, as a metaphor, the word calves contributes to the poem's surreal bestiary. When you stop to notice, it's actually striking how many animals there are in this poem. You might think of it or expect to find a poem of a sort of desolate white waste, but actually it's a poem filled with animals. So far, we've met the land lice, the gramersow, the millipede, the word louse, the wood lice, and the prey pursued by those skittering hunters. In this context, too, it helps to know that gramersow is actually a metaphor. Grammar is an abbreviation of the word grandmother, and sow means a female pig. So a gramersow is a granny pig. Elsewhere in the poem, there are owls, an old bear, and a fox. There's an unblubbered monster, presumably that's a whale. There's a benign creature with a small ear hole, perhaps a seal or a walrus, and there's a honking choir of geese, presumably. Many of these animals belong in the frozen north, but others don't. Some are there in the sense that Mooney is imagined seeing or hearing them. Those animals are firmly part of the diegesis. But other animals live instead in Mooney's memory or imagination, or they are invoked by the words Mooney uses. The poem's bestiary extends from the glacier's calves to the calves of whales and reindeer, and to other animals who also appear only as figurative intimations. So in that first stanza, Mooney says, "From wherever it is I urge these words to find their subtle vents, the northern dazzle of silence cranes to watch." It's easy enough to skip over that verb cranes, or perhaps just to think of mechanical cranes. The captain of Nansen's ship, Otto Sverdrup, recorded having to erect a small crane to hold a drill used to bore holes in the ice for explosives, which were detonated to blast the ship free from pack ice. But in fact, both the verb to crane and the name of the machine, crane, derive metaphorically from the name of the bird, so that in Malcolm Mooney's land, the northern lights stretch their necks up and over Moon like cranes. Cranes and calves, as well as whales and geese, belong in Malcolm Mooney's land because they are proper to its bestiary. To find these animals in those verbs seems appropriate because of the word's placement alongside other words, from fox to gramersow. In that short statement on poetry, Graham said that the meaning of a word in a poem is never more than its position. The meanings of words are shaped by surrounding words. And in a 1949 letter to Edward Morgan, Graham wrote that an incidental fiction is created behind every poem, and automatically it has its words which are native to it, and then less native to it, as the words become less organic to it, till at the extreme is the stranger, which can be fitted in as a shock word only at very special occasions. Now, this sense of the poem as an organic whole allows Graham to move or skitter between jargon, metaphor, dialect, and a supposedly standard vocabulary. That is to say, between lead, crane, bonny, and glacier. The organic whole welcomes into its coherent totality even gramersow as pun or as coinage. There are, therefore, at least two forms of propriety continually at play in the diction of the poem: the semantic and the indexical. Calves belongs in Malcolm Mooney's land as index, as a word attached to the frozen north and to those who venture into it. But calves also belongs as metaphor. And Malcolm Mooney's land even makes room for gramersow because whale calves and millipedes belong to the poem's incidental fiction or fictive world. What's more, gramersow has its own indexical attachments, both collective and individual, and those attachments complicate and expand the poem's world. I'm almost done, Orca, I promise. The notion of an organic whole does not, however, mean that anything goes. There are limits. Graham cautioned that in one of Morgan's poems, the word boomerang was completely out of its element. In that poem, Graham said boomerang was not organic. An Australian reader, looking at Malcolm's land, might laugh at the image of land lice riding in the seams of an Arctic explorer, because in Australia, land lice is a colloquial term for sheep. But that Australian reader is likely to put the short thought of sheep out of mind because, after all, Antipodean sheep don't belong in Malcolm's land. They aren't natives. Now, to decide what belongs is to decide on the basis of some sense of the whole. The poetic propriety of a word lies not only in its categorization in isolation as dialect or technical term, but in its relations with other words. It relies also on the reader's own social affiliations. Graham's letter to Morgan borrows the logic of centre and periphery, common to debates about diction, but it displaces that logic onto the poem. Rather than it being the language or the community which has native words and strangers, it's the poem that has native words and strangers. The language of Malcolm Mooney's land is not that of an Arctic explorer, a Cornish farmer, or a learned philologist. Instead, the words of the poem index various forms of life, and a given word may be both native to a poem and a shock to some readers. To displace centre and periphery onto the poem this way, I think, is to produce what we might call a partial detachment from attachment. It's a rather Eliotic formulation. The words retain attachments to particular communities, but that attachment is itself part of the poem's own world. So, to finish, I've suggested that the poem's world making incorporates not only referentiality but also indexicality. The scope and texture of Malcolm Mooney's land, it seems to me, are determined by the kinds of words Graham chooses and by the communities to whom those words belong. I've suggested that this is because the poem itself is a coherent whole, a structure of temporal and spatial relations, or, if you like, a world. But I think finally we need to ask what form of life is indexed by organic totality, or by this conception of the poem as an organic totality, especially when the poem in question is as variegated and synthetic as Graham's. Now, one answer would be to say that this world of the poem in itself is a seemingly blank and abstract aesthetic, which, as a kind of ideological whiteout or smokescreen, obscures the poem's political dimensions and actually indexes political power. The idea would be that it's all very well to substitute the world of the poem for the real world, but that to do so would be to forget the inequalities and injustices of that real world. Now, that's a hard argument to make about the work of a Scottish poet living in poverty in rural England, but it would be possible. Another answer, and I have to say the answer that I find more sympathetic, would be to remember that the detachment is only ever partial, and that Graham's diction remains invested in the experiences of multiple so-called peripheries. This would be to decide that the poem's world making, insofar as it makes a world out of materials culled from this world, and precisely because it is partially detached from this world, critiques that world of inequality and injustice. And I think that'll probably do. Maybe I hope that was helpful. I hope most of all you just like the poem because it's a super poem, and there's a lot more to talk about. Well, a lot more about the poem to talk about, which I haven't got to. But I hope that was helpful. If you've got any questions, I'm very happy to talk.
Thank you so much, Sean. There was a wonderful talk, and it covered a lot of grounds about and made us think about how poetry produces worlds through diction and multiple worlds, perhaps, right? Depending on cultural difference, where the reader is coming from, and the difference between center and periphery in terms of diction, the use of jargon, producing another kind of world, as it were, for at least particular readers who are versed with that jargon, right? It's very interesting. And I mean, I would reserve a few questions that I might have, but let me see if others want to ask first. I think anyone can unmute themselves and ask a question, or if you want to put it in the chat box, I'll be happy to relay that to Sean. So please feel free to ask your questions either in the chat box, or if you want, please unmute yourself and questions, comments. Maybe while others think, let me perhaps abuse the position of the chair to ask you the first question.
Sure.
So this is, I mean, somewhat outside the purview of your paper, but I was just generally
Mm-hmm.
wondering, given that it has that sort of, that modernist lineage of a kind of self-referentiality when we consider the poem itself to be Malcolm Mooney's land, and
Sure.
also the reference to the white page, this sort of
Mm-hmm.
constant self-reflexive
Mm-hmm.
reference to language. and also the
Yep.
connections the poem makes between ice and words, language and
Yes.
the Arctic ambience. So this idea of a frozen language, right? And I think at some
Yep.
point,
Yep.
language is called an obstacle, and the voice asks whether I've been using this obstacle of language well, and then the idea of a frozen language appears. So I was just wondering what would be, because I don't know much about the poet, did he have a particular philosophical position on language, uh, other than the kind of social questions that we discussed here, where we were talking primarily about the social life of language, right? I mean, and how it appears in different contexts, and the difference between language and dialect, and how he doesn't choose a dialect and yet seems to use almost dialectal jargon words. Like, and there was a wonderful reading of the grammar saw, by the way, that will stay with me. But yeah, that's
No,
the question I wanted to ask. Yeah, thank you.
yeah, and that's a good question. Um, so I mean, it's not the case, for instance, that he has a sustained philosophical position or poetics, um, in the way that many another modernist did. For the simple reason that he just doesn't write very much criticism. So he's not a poet who buttresses his own work um, with an elaborate critical apparatus that like it's often said about T.S. Eliot, for instance. He writes about all these other people, but he's actually also providing you with a framework for reading his own poems. Now, Graham doesn't do that. There are a few short critical pieces. There are some very interesting letters, um, and I quoted from one of the critical pieces a couple of times, but it's not sustained in the same way as for other poets. I think that's fair to say. Um, that said, uh, a lot of his poetry is about poetry. So it is sort of regularly meta poetic in the way that Malcolm Mooney's Land is. It's Shrew of the Night Fishing too. So it's a kind of a routine preoccupation for him. So if you're going to look for a kind of a poetics or a philosophy of language, really the place to look is the poems. But that's complicated by the fact that they're poems rather than critical statements. Does that help, Orko?
Yeah, no, thank you. That does qualify. I mean, because I'm not at all well versed with his poetry, I was just kind of thinking. In fact, there's one question from, so there are a couple of questions in the chat box. One from Shumit Pramanik,
Yeah.
which actually echoes a question I wanted to ask you as well, but maybe not just the influence behind this particular poem, which is his question, but I was generally wondering who were the poets he was influenced by, and who were perhaps his interlocutors in the poetic diction, or the kind of tradition that he saw himself a part of, right? So that's the question from Shomit Pramanik. But to be fair to his question is, what's the main influence behind Graham's poem?
Behind this poem, I think it's too late in Graham's career to say that there's a clear influence on this poem. He's a mature poet by this point. Um, it's certainly often said, and certainly was said at the time, that his early poetry is heavily influenced by Dylan Thomas. And he knew Thomas. He was then published by Eliot. His first book was published, The White Threshold, by Eliot, Faber, and Faber. So he knows Eliot personally, or at least he meets Eliot and knows Eliot's work. He refers to Pound at various points, so a fairly canonical modernism. He also knows, and I think is pretty clearly conscious of, or working in relation to Hugh MacDermott, the Scottish poet. Um, uh, Not least because MacDermott, in say a drunk man looks at the thistle, is writing in Scots, right? Like, and part of MacDermott's real project was to revivify Scots as a language for poetry. Graham never really, his efforts in Scots are not nearly so concerted. but it's a constant resource for him. That would be a way of putting it. Critics sometimes say that in the same way that, it's not as though Malcolm Mooney's Land is a poem in Cornish dialect. It's just got the odd Cornish dialect word in there, a bit like sort of sultanas in a cake, or currants in a cake, right? And people often say the same thing about Scots, right? They're poems whose basic idiom is English or standard English, or reasonably standard English, and then there'll be Scots words scattered here and there to give a flavor of this, or to ground the poem in a childhood experience or whatever it might be. Graham grew up just near Glasgow, and so is and he actually refers to Scots as refers to reading Burns, actually. I think it's reading Burns's Scots poems, and about the nostalgia that this has for him, because it brings back to him the language of his child. So who have I? Yeah. Pound, Eliot, McDermott. He obviously knows Burns and Scott's poetry. There's a thread of dramatic monologues in Graham's work sometimes, but I can't think of him ever referring to a Browning or a Tennyson. But presumably that's there. It's a good question, and Varani asked a good question too. My apologies if I have mispronounced your name, about the concept of world. Yeah, look, I mean, it was a provocation, right? That was the experiment that I set myself for me. Yeah, you could very happily make an argument about the diction of Malcolm Mooney's Land or about Graham's diction without worrying yourself with the concept of world. The paper comes out of an essay that I wrote a little while ago that doesn't really deal with world. It was a challenge that I wanted to set for myself, I suppose, because I had been reading various things about world making, literary world making, and poetry was a kind of sore thumb in those theories, or a glitch in the mechanism of those theories of world making. And so it was an experiment. But you could certainly make the same arguments about indexicality and the way the poem is kind of harnessing, that's probably a good word for it, harnessing the indexicality of the words that it uses, at least on occasion. The other warrant for thinking about world, or for employing the concept of world, is that letter, which I quoted right at the end, in which Graham talks about the incidental fiction. It helps. Malcolm Mooney's Land is an easy example to choose because it's a dramatic monologue, and so the diegesis is obvious, if you like. There's a speaker in a place at a particular time, and so there's a kind of diegetic aspect to it that's not true of, I don't know, how do I love thee, let me count the ways, whatever it might be, of other kinds of lyric, and certainly of many of Graham's other poems. So I guess that would be how I would justify it, at least as a thought experiment. I don't know if you will find that persuasive, Barani, and if you don't, that's perfectly fine. If you like the poem, I've done my job.
In fact, he says maybe he would prefer the word discourse over world. But anyway, I guess we could continue that discussion. But I see Aditi has a question. Aditi, please feel free to unmute yourself and speak. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for the talk. And sorry if my question meanders a bit. That's why I didn't type, because I'm thinking through the question and I thought it might be better to just ask. I did really enjoy this talk, and made me a lot. I've had questions about poetic diction for some time, so perhaps I'll just try to bring it together. So my first question is, would there be a difference in how we see lyric and narrative poetry? You did mention it, but I mean, I haven't read anything by Graham before. So, and looking at the poem that you were talking about, I mean, would you count it as narrative poetry rather than lyric? And would that make a difference in how you see the importance of the indexicality? So that would be the first question. The second question is probably more general about the importance of poetic diction really to a poem. Because, I mean, if you had asked Aristotle, whom you mentioned, he would have said what makes a poem is meter. So that's the minimum that you require. And then there are other things, and diction would be one of the secondary characteristics. And when you would read a poem, for example, a classical poem, how would you tell if it's a poem from a particular time? How would you differentiate between a poem by Virgil or Ovid? I mean, that's where it might help to some extent. But so in that sense, you know, the indexicality of it helps. But I was really wondering, you know, given, well, we are looking at modernist poetry. And so one of the first things I was thinking of was Hopkins as as I was listening to you. And I remember I read somewhere that he said, you know, clearness at first reading is not what is most important in a poem. And in that sense, I think poets do make a demand on the reader, philological demand, sometimes very overtly, like Eliot does in The Wasteland, where he also gives you, footnotes to go and explore things, and then also his choice of diction. He really does pick up words from French, from Italian, from German, and they all become something that are pretty personal to him. So, you know, you brought this up at the end, the idea of personal diction. And is there a sense that in modernist poetry, the sense of the diction is my choice, my style, my metaphor, my jargon, and my experiences. And in that sense, you can't really separate the poet from the poem and the poet's experience. So if he uses a Cornish word, he has all right to use a Cornish word, or a Scottish word, or a Latin or Greek word if necessary, if that is his idiolect in some ways. So, you know, that could be, so what would that do to the question of indexicality of the words in the poem? And then I was thinking of Joyce or Milton. I mean, Milton's Il Penseroso, for example, it's half Latin, and but nevertheless, it's a poem that you know, you would not say that, you know, Milton is just being, I don't know, a classicist or whatever. Joyce's, I mean, I was thinking more of the novels. You know, he uses words from all over. So I was really wondering about, you know, this question of indexicality and how much importance we should place on it when it comes to modernist poetry. Sorry, it's too general a question. But yeah, thinking.
Yeah, no, there's so much that's rich there. I'm almost certainly not going to do it all justice, but let me try, and I'll try and remember everything. I think the first thing to say is that I tend not to be dogmatic when it comes to what defines a lyric or what's most important in poetry. My approach would instead be to have a look at what people have thought in response to those questions, and to allow for different people in different places at different times to have thought different things, or for that matter, even in the same place at the same time. So, sure, you could make a distinction between narrative and lyric poetry, and you might well say that Malcolm Mooney's Land is more narrative than some other kinds of lyric, because it's a dramatic monologue. Sure, that's totally fine. It depends what you mean by lyric, really. If by lyric you mean short, well, it's short. if by lyric you mean something else, then not. That's totally fine. I'm happy to work with the definitions that are important to others. But that's why I said to Orko that it was an easy choice when thinking about world to choose Malcolm Mooney's Land than to choose other kinds of lyric poem, which, if you like, don't have that narrative. That's definitely the case. Is diction as important to narrative poetry as lyric poetry? Yes, I think so. I mean, example that occurs to me for what it's worth is Homer. I mean, Homer's diction, his vocabulary is sort of ostentatiously archaic at points and varied, sort of synthetic. It's not the language which anybody. It's not even just that it's archaic at the time of composition. It's also synthetic in the sense that it moves across the dialects of archaic Greece, and therefore it's not a language which any single person or any single community at any point in history spoke, right? Like it's a compound, and that is important to the poem's effect, and it's a narrative compound. So yes, diction can be hugely important to narrative poetry too. Your excellent example of Milton would be would make the case as well, right? Like Milton's famous or infamous Latinity is certainly important to the poem, essential to Paradise Lost. Now, about modernism and idiolect. That's also a really good question. Again, I probably would avoid generalizations and would want to think about how diction works for different modernist poets. So if you were to take the example of, I mean, a poet of whom I'm very fond, someone like Yeats, right? Now, Yeats's vocabulary is extraordinarily small. He uses the same words over and over and over and over and over and over again. And it can mean that reading Yeats's collected poems is a bit of a slog sometimes. You know, if the standard sort of justification for Shakespeare's greatness is that his vocabulary is so enormous, one could never use that as a justification for Yeats because, relatively speaking, his vocabulary is. Moreover, for Yeats, it was important that he was using a vocabulary which was almost wholly sanctified by tradition. There aren't any telephones in Yeats. There aren't any metros in Yeats, you know, like underground railways. There's very little in the way of technical jargon or whatever. It's in many ways a traditional vocabulary. That doesn't prevent it from being tremendous poetry in all sorts of ways, but it becomes an idiolect to the extent that a Yeats poem is, you know, in 1927 or whatever, it's kind of unlike poetry by anybody else at the time, precisely because everybody else is doing something else, right? So it has a perverse idiolectical quality, if you like. Now, what's an alternative? You think about someone like Mina Loy. This is to stick to, you know, I guess Anglo-American modernists, Irish Anglo-American modernists. If you're someone like Mina Loy, her vocabulary is nothing like Yeats's and is full of scientific terms, medical terms, abstractions, Latinisms, Greekisms, which she borrows from or she gets from a whole range of sources or discourses. And that too becomes something of an idiolect. I would say partly because of what she does with the vocabulary. So in my reading of Loy, the choice of words, so kind of instance of Jakobson's poetic function, is determined as much by the sound play she can generate across words as it is by the use of the words. But of course, they also have their indexical function. So it is important to her to be using words from chemistry or words from medicine, whatever else. So, yeah, I don't know if that fully answers your question about modernism and idiolect. I think they are both examples, actually, of modernist poets borrowing words, if you like, or inheriting words, as we all do necessarily. Almost nobody invents words, right? I mean, there's Milton and pandemonium, but even that's kind of a compound, right? But making those words their own through combination and so on and so forth. So the generation of something like video. Then there is the final question about the importance of diction to poetry. And I guess I would say that I mean, I certainly didn't mean to make a claim for diction's priority over meter or metaphor, whatever it might be. It's just interesting. It's also an aspect of poetry that hasn't always received as much attention as meter or metaphor. I mean, it has here and there, and someone mentioned, Barani mentioned, it's nice to hear about Donald Davy. No, not so often heard these days. That's true. And Purity of Diction in English Verse is a great book in all sorts of ways, and it is easy to misread Davy, to make him sound even worse than he is, so to speak. He has some good books. But I really wasn't meaning to make a claim about the diction as the most important aspect of poetry. But others have said that at points in the past. So that's Thomas Gray. I mean, I mentioned Thomas Gray right at the start. Thomas Gray's position is that it's diction that defines poetry, and that poetry has a diction which is different from other discourses or other uses of language. Even Wordsworth, I mean, I might have this wrong, but I am fairly sure that that Wordsworth in the preface says that because the language of poetry ought to be the language of ordinary people, there is, if you like, a kind of continuum between poetry and other uses of language, or fundamentally not a difference, not a distinction between them. I may be misremembering that. Don't quote. Obviously, Wordsworth in the preface, certainly in the second edition, Lyrical Ballads, is also very interested in meter. He has plenty to say about that, the differences, and so on. So I would say that at some point in history, for some people, diction has been more important than at other points for other people. I think that's not really meant to be fence sitting, but maybe it comes across as fence sitting. I think that it would be, and the final thing to say is that this doesn't respond to a specific question, I think, but it occurred to me as you were speaking. One of the peculiar things about Grammar-sow, which is my favorite word in the poem, is that Graham was not Cornish, right? Like, he can say bonny as a Scot, fine. And he can use English as a Scot, fine. But Grammar-sow is a word he has heard and borrowed. It doesn't seem like an act of culpable appropriation in this poem, but the concept of diction does allow for arguments about culpable appropriation. So very famously, Michael North wrote about Stein and Pound and Eliot and their use of Black American vernaculars, and what they were doing with it, and the sort of negative political consequences or aspects of that appropriation. Precisely because diction has this sometimes overt indexicality, it is involved in, I guess you could say, the politics of identity, or the politics of voice, of who gets to speak for whom, and so on. So I thought that was probably good. Have I answered everything that all of your good questions?
Sorry, sorry if I meandered a lot in my questions.
No, not at all.
Okay. Thank you, Aditi, and there was a nice conversation. I just wanted to, it's a comment. It's more like, an acknowledgement of the fact that I enjoyed that part of the argument where you made that distinction between the diegetic and the non-diegetic, and the analogy bringing in objects that are not necessarily part of the diegetic world of the poem. And that, again,
Right.
I think, in some sense, perhaps may stake a sort of claim about the value of world as a term here. Because again, I mean, in
Sure.
poetry, perhaps much more than prose and narrative prose, there are so many non-diegetic objects. I mean, we do not necessarily think of the poetic world necessarily, at least in a diegetic sense, right? And this poem,
Yep.
because it
Yep.
has the sort of structure of a journal almost at certain points, especially the way it
Mm-hmm.
mentions the passing days. Almost every section,
Mm-hmm.
if I remember correctly, mentions a new day. So maybe Tuesday when it starts, and then
Yep.
all the way to
Yep.
Friday. So that
Yep.
I
Yep.
think creates another kind of almost a diary form, as it were. So I was just kind of
Yep.
thinking
Yep.
about that, right? And one question I had though, I think maybe it was not again the point to elaborate on that part of your argument, but I'm just curious, how would you read these animal tropes that you talked about? I mean, not necessarily in relation to your argument, but generally, how
Sure.
would you read these animal tropes in the poem?
Do you mean like why are they there? Like,
Um,
um,
what are they doing? What's their functionality? I mean, that's what I was kind of wondering, more than why they're
that's a
there.
very good. That's a very good question. The first half of your question is easier to answer than the second half, so I'll start with the first. So, yeah, I guess part of the provocation of my argument was that there is a continuum, if you like, going from the actual animals that are actually there in the imagined or diegetic world, right? So there's actually a fox. Um, the hunters are presumably uh, uh, actually chasing actual um, animals, whatever they might be. And then there are other animals which Mooney thinks of, um, if you like, in this sort of diary process, the diary thinking that you're right is kind of neatly marked out by the days of the week. Um, uh, so there's a fox was actually there, but then he also thinks of um, uh, his friend who loves owls. Now the owls aren't actually out there on the ice with him, but he's thinking of the owls. So my provocation, my contention was that the owls too are in some sense part of the world of the poem. Yeah, then you can push it further and say, and the same thing is true of the grammar sow and the word louse, insofar as the land lice are actually there, and they are compared to the grammar sow and word louse. Grammar sow and word louse are said to be brothers of them. That's complicated because grammar sow and word louse are both kind of neologisms, right? So they're kind of playful um, inventions, which nevertheless, I argued, invoke the actual animals um, that form their basis, right? So um, even if Grammar is Graham's misspelling of Grammar with an E, nevertheless, the word, for someone who's familiar with Cornish, will make them think of a millipede, right? And presumably Mooney too is conscious that at the back of that neologism, there are millipedes, right? So you have the fox, you have the owls, you have the millipedes, in a kind of movement away from diegesis, if that makes sense. And then ultimately you have the genuinely figurative animals. And so I was trying to push the argument as far as I could go and say, all right, well, if the northern dazzle of silence cranes, are there also cranes? Or if the glacier calves, are there also calves? And the argument I made was that, well, because there are so many other animals in the poem, the poem is prompting you to find animals even in those metaphors, or to so that was the case. I could imagine someone saying, no, that's too much, you're pushing it too far. That's fine. So my argument about world, at least taken to its logical extreme, is that the world of the poem extends from diegesis to even metaphorical animals about which Mooney himself need not be thinking. That would be a way. Now, then there's the question of why all these animals. I don't really know, Orko. It's yeah. I mean, I suppose you might make an argument about isolation and the experience of the imagined Arctic explorer who is, writing a diary for, in some fashion, the Elizabeth at home, or certainly who has a family at home and who has lost his companions, right? Like right at the start, he talks about those poor friends that he buried earlier. So there's a kind of, if you wanted to think about it in terms of a psychology, you might say that there's a kind of hallucination of animal companionship as a compensation for the human isolation. That would be a way of putting it. I didn't do very much in my talk with Mooney himself as a character or his psychology, but you could do, obviously, and the poem is very rich, and in some ways that's what's so moving about it. I don't know if that is that what you were thinking. Did you have other
No,
thoughts?
no. That definitely makes. In fact, the clarification you made also makes me think about how this point feeds into that argument about co-creation, right? Because it's not
Right.
necessarily a question of poetic intent. It's not that the poet necessarily wants us to read the word calves, not just as a verb, but also as a reference to calf. But
Sure.
with the literal referencing of the animals in the poem, there's an invitation to read the polyphony of the word. And that invitation is an invitation to the reader. So, in a sense, the calf produced by the verb is produced by the reader, whereas perhaps the other animals are mentioned, the diegetically mentioned animals are mentioned in some sense by the poet. So again, this is too neat, of course, it will be more complicated than this, but I'm just thinking whether the diegetic and the non-diegetic worlds together contribute to this co-creation of the poem as a world between the poet and the
Sure.
reader.
That's very nicely put. Yep, I would happily endorse that. That makes good sense to me.
I think we've run out of time. So unless there's like a pressing last question from someone, we would call it a day. Is there a last desperate question someone wants to ask about Malcolm Mooney's land or anything else? Let me just check the chat box. I don't think there's anything new there. Okay, so that leaves me with the opportunity to thank Sean. Thank you so much for joining and giving us so much time and having such a nice, in a sense, brooding and intense discussion about a beautiful poem that I read last night. But I mean, I would read the poem again after your talk. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks very much for having me, and I really hope that was helpful. And if you
Thank
can,
you,
read some more,
everyone.
great.
Sure. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Bikram, for recording. You may stop the recording now. It will be automatically saved in cloud. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, Sean. Bye. Bye, everyone.